In January of 1948, New York City lost something it did not yet realize it would one day mourn. The air was cold along Riverside Drive. The Hudson River moved in slow, grey silence. Snow clung to the edges of the pavement, and behind a tall fence of iron and stone, demolition crews prepared their machines. Before them stood a palace, the mansion of Charles M. Schwab. 75 rooms, limestone walls thick as fortress ramparts, turrets rising like something borrowed from the Loire Valley. Copper domes dulled slightly by winter light, windows tall and arched, once glowing at night like lanterns suspended in the sky. For more than 4 decades, this house had been one of the most extravagant private residences in America. Now it was scheduled to die. There were no crowds gathered in outrage, no preservation committees blocking the gates, no television cameras broadcasting its final hours. Only a handful of onlookers, curious neighbours, and workers with sledgehammers waiting for orders. The first blow landed without ceremony. Stone cracked, marble splintered, a piece of America fell. The Schwab mansion had been completed in 1906 at the height of what historians would later call the Gilded Age, a period of explosive industrial growth, staggering wealth accumulation, and architectural ambition unlike anything the country had seen before. It was an era of titans. Railroad empires stitched together continents, steel skeletons rose into the sky, oil, banking, mining, manufacturing. Fortunes were being created at speeds the world had never witnessed. And with those fortunes came something else, competition, not merely for wealth, but for permanence. The men who built these empires did not just want money, they wanted legacy, they wanted proof, they wanted monuments, and so they built them, along Fifth Avenue, along Riverside Drive, across Long Island's Gold Coast. They built palaces. Charles Michael Schwab was not born into wealth. He came into the world in 1862 in Loretto, Pennsylvania, the son of a modest German immigrant family. There were no marble floors in his childhood home, no ballrooms, no stained glass. There was discipline, work, ambition. By the age of 18, Schwab was already employed in the steel industry. By 35, he was president of Carnegie Steel, personally chosen by Andrew Carnegie himself. He was brilliant, charismatic, restless. When Carnegie sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901, forming U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history, Schwab played a pivotal role in negotiating the deal. His reward was immense, tens of millions of dollars, in today's terms, billions. And unlike Carnegie, who retreated into philanthropy and libraries, Schwab chose something else. He chose spectacle. The mansion on Riverside Drive was his declaration. It spanned an entire city block between 73rd and 74th Street. While New York's elite still clung to Fifth Avenue, Schwab selected the Upper West Side, at the time considered unfashionable, and transformed it into a personal kingdom. He hired the best architects money could command. The design was inspired by French Renaissance chateaux, a deliberate echo of European aristocracy. Turrets, steep slate roofs, limestone facades, ornate iron gates guarding a sunken garden. Inside, it was beyond opulence. There were 75 rooms, a grand ballroom capable of hosting hundreds of guests, an indoor swimming pool, a rarity in private American homes, a bowling alley, a Moorish smoking lounge, an art gallery, a vast music room where orchestras performed beneath painted ceilings, Italian marble-lined hallways and staircases, carved oak panels wrapped the walls of the dining room. Chandeliers the size of automobiles descended from ceilings 30 feet high. One room was panelled entirely in Circassian walnut, imported at enormous expense from the Caucasus Mountains. No detail was spared. This was not a house. It was an empire enclosed in stone. But the Schwab mansion was not merely decorative excess. It was technologically advanced, revolutionary even. At a time when many Americans still lived without electricity or indoor plumbing, the Riverside Chateau operated with its own private electrical plant. It generated its own power. It illuminated hundreds of bulbs long before city grids could guarantee reliability. Elevators whisked guests between floors. A telephone system connected rooms internally. Advanced plumbing delivered hot and cold running water to marble-clad bathrooms fitted with gold fixtures. Heating systems maintained comfort through brutal New York winters. To step inside was to glimpse the future, filtered through gold leaf and crystal. The mansion was not only wealth displayed, it was innovation on display. And then there were the parties, politicians, opera singers, industrialists, foreign dignitaries. They passed beneath the iron gates as if entering Versailles. Champagne flowed without measure. Floral arrangements were flown in weekly from South America. Menus were crafted by European chefs. Orchestras played until dawn. Schwab lived loudly. He gambled heavily, entertained lavishly, spent freely. It was said he once lost $10 million in a single year in Monte Carlo. To Schwab, money was not meant to be guarded. It was meant to move, to glitter, to astonish. And his mansion embodied that philosophy perfectly. But history does not pause for extravagance. The optimism of the Gilded Age began to erode. World War I disrupted markets. Economic instability crept in. Cultural values shifted. A new generation questioned the morality of such public displays of wealth. Then came 1929. The stock market crash did not discriminate. Fortunes evaporated. Schwab, who had never been cautious, was exposed. Risky investments, excessive spending, a lifestyle that required continuous abundance. By the mid-1930s, he was deeply in debt. The mansion that once symbolized triumph became a liability. Its annual maintenance cost a fortune. No buyers emerged. No institution wanted to inherit such an enormous burden. The country had changed. Excess was no longer admirable. It was embarrassing. Schwab died in 1939, far removed from the glittering peak of his influence. His palace remained, but it was already fading. After his death, city officials debated the mansion's fate. Could it become a museum, a government building, a cultural centre? The discussions went nowhere. Maintenance costs were astronomical. Property taxes continued to rise. The land itself, valuable and expansive, became more desirable than the structure standing upon it. Practicality won. Preservation lost. And so, in 1948, demolition began. Wrecking balls tore through carved stone that had taken artisans months to perfect. Marble columns collapsed into rubble. Bronze fixtures were stripped without ceremony. Hand-carved woodwork splintered beneath steel teeth. The ballroom fell silent. The pool drained. The gardens flattened. By 1950, the palace was gone. In its place rose Schwab House, a modern apartment complex, efficient, practical, rectangular, unremarkable. The name survived. The grandeur did not. And yet the Schwab mansion was not alone. Across New York, similar palaces were vanishing. Along Fifth Avenue, along Madison, along the Gold Coast of Long Island, mansions that once represented the pinnacle of American ambition were being replaced by office towers, department stores, and apartment blocks. The question lingers: how does a city erase its own monuments? How do symbols of an entire era disappear so completely that most people walking those streets today have no idea what once stood there? The answer lies not in a single demolition order. It lies in transformation. Cities evolve, economies shift, values change. What was once considered eternal can become inconvenient. What once symbolized progress can become a reminder of imbalance. The Gilded Age built boldly, but it did not build forever. As the marble fell on Riverside Drive, something larger than a mansion collapsed. It was the illusion of permanence, the belief that wealth carved into stone could resist time, the idea that architecture alone could guarantee legacy. In truth, even the grandest walls are temporary, but stories endure, and that is why we return now, not merely to mourn lost buildings, but to understand them. Because these mansions were more than houses. They were statements. They were laboratories of technology. They were theatres of power. They were ecosystems of labour. They were reflections of a country discovering its strength and struggling with its excess. And before we can explore the other 6 forgotten palaces, before we understand why they rose and why they fell, we must step backward, back to the beginning, back to the explosive birth of the Gilded Age itself, where fortunes ignited like sparks in a steel mill, where Fifth Avenue transformed into Millionaire's Row, where America decided that ambition should be measured in marble, and where the skyline began to whisper a dangerous promise: build high enough, and you might outlast time. Towards skyscrapers. Fifth Avenue was towards skyscrapers. Fifth Avenue was quiet. In the 1850s, it was still lined with modest homes and open stretches of land. Horse-drawn carriages rolled slowly across unpaved roads. The city had not yet surged northward. Manhattan above 42nd Street still felt distant, almost rural. But America was changing faster than its streets could keep up. Railroads were stitching together the continent. Steel mills roared day and night. Oil derricks punctured the earth. Banks swelled with capital. Factories multiplied. And wealth, staggering, unprecedented wealth, was accumulating in private hands. By the 1870s, something extraordinary was happening. Men who had been born into modest circumstances were becoming richer than European princes. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John Jacob Astor. They were not aristocrats in the old world sense. They had no inherited castles, no ancestral estates stretching back centuries. But they had something more powerful: industry. And industry was printing money. As fortunes grew, so did the need to display them, because wealth in the Gilded Age was not meant to be invisible. It was meant to be seen. By competitors, by investors, by society, by the world. And nowhere in America was better suited for that display than New York City. It was the financial capital, the shipping capital, the cultural capital, the gateway to immigration, and the engine of industry. If you wanted your success recognized, you built in New York, and if you wanted your success immortalized, you built on Fifth Avenue. By the 1880s, Fifth Avenue between 23rd Street and 59th Street began transforming into something entirely new. Row upon row of palatial mansions rose along its length. Newspapers gave it a name that said everything: Millionaires' Row. The name was not ironic. It was a declaration. Here stood the most concentrated display of private wealth on earth. The architecture was not modest. It was theatrical. Many of America's wealthiest families turned to Europe for inspiration, particularly France. The Beaux-Arts style, born from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, became the architectural language of American ambition. Symmetry, grand staircases, Corinthian columns, ornate stone facades, sculpted pediments, ironwork balconies, carved cherubs and classical figures watching silently from rooftops. These homes were not cottages enlarged. They were palaces transplanted. The message was unmistakable. America had arrived. The Vanderbilt family led the charge. William Henry Vanderbilt, son of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, erected what became known as the Triple Palace, 3 interconnected mansions occupying an entire block between 51st and 52nd Street. Its scale was astonishing. Visitors described its facade as fortress-like. Stone walls thick and unyielding, massive arched windows, ornate carvings that rivaled European chateaux. Inside, the rooms glowed. Ballrooms spanned entire floors. Libraries housed rare volumes bound in leather and gold leaf. Art galleries displayed works by Rembrandt, Van Dyck and Turner. Dining rooms shimmered beneath Venetian chandeliers. Every room was curated, every corridor intentional. Even the ceilings were art. Painted panels depicting mythological scenes, allegories of commerce and power, triumph and civilization. To be invited inside was not merely a social privilege. It was an initiation into a new American aristocracy. And yet, Millionaires' Row was not just about aesthetics. It was competition. Each new mansion aimed to outdo the last. If one family installed marble from Carrara, another imported darker stone from Greece. If one ballroom could host 300 guests, another would be designed for 500. Gardens were laid out by European landscape architects. Greenhouses grew exotic orchids year-round. Carriage houses expanded to accommodate the newest automobiles as the 20th century approached. This was architectural one-upmanship on a monumental scale. Money was not spent, it was performed. The interiors were equally revolutionary. While much of America still relied on gas lamps and outhouses, Millionaires' Row boasted private power plants and advanced plumbing systems. Electricity illuminated grand staircases long before municipal grids became reliable. Elevators, once industrial novelties, were installed in private homes, complete with brass fittings and velvet-lined cabins. Hot water systems supplied marble bathtubs large enough to resemble small pools. Early forms of climate control kept rooms comfortable through humid summers. To step into one of these homes was to enter the future. These mansions were not merely beautiful. They were technologically decades ahead of most American households. But outside their iron gates, just a few miles south, immigrants crowded into tenement buildings. Factories belched smoke into already thick air. Families shared single rooms. Child labour was common. Sanitation was inconsistent. The contrast was staggering. On Fifth Avenue, silk gowns swept across marble floors. In the Lower East Side, children slept 3 to a bed. Newspapers began to take notice. Reformers criticised the opulence. Was this success or excess? Was it triumph or imbalance? Millionaires' Row became both admired and resented, a symbol of American opportunity and American inequality at the same time. Yet criticism did little to slow construction. If anything, it fueled it. Because these homes were not built solely for comfort, they were statements of permanence. These men believed their fortunes would endure for generations. They believed their names would be etched into history as securely as their facades were carved in stone. And in many ways they were correct. We still speak their names, but their houses, most are gone. By the early 20th century, the city began to shift again. Commerce crept north. Retail stores expanded. Hotels rose. Property values soared. Taxes increased. The very avenue that once symbolized exclusivity became increasingly commercial. Families who had once competed for space on Fifth Avenue began relocating further uptown or out to Long Island estates. Their mansions, too expensive to maintain and impractical in a rapidly modernizing city, stood vulnerable. Developers saw something different when they looked at these palaces. Not legacy, opportunity. An entire city block occupied by a single residence was inefficient. Apartment buildings could house hundreds. Department stores could generate continuous revenue. Office towers could rise even higher than limestone facades. And so the slow erasure began. One by one, the mansions fell. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace was demolished in 1927. In its place rose a commercial building, now home to a luxury retailer. Other homes were converted temporarily into clubs or offices before eventually being torn down. Ballrooms were stripped, art was auctioned, marble fireplaces were salvaged or discarded. Entire chapters of architectural ambition disappeared within months. Today, if you walk along Fifth Avenue between 49th and 59th Street, you will see almost no trace of Millionaires' Row. Glass towers reflect sunlight where carved stone once glowed. Tourists queue for storefronts where orchestras once played. The transformation feels complete. But beneath the pavement lies memory. Millionaires' Row was more than an address. It was a psychological turning point. For the first time in history, America's wealthiest citizens were building not merely homes but dynastic monuments. They believed industry had made them equal to Europe's nobility, and perhaps even superior. They believed architecture could immortalize them. But the city was always moving, and New York, more than any other place, refuses to stand still. The same energy that allowed these fortunes to grow so rapidly ensured their architectural expressions would not last forever. Growth demands replacement, modernity demands space, and permanence in Manhattan is an illusion. Yet something of Millionaires' Row survives, not in stone, but in influence. The Beaux-Arts style shaped museums, libraries, and civic buildings across America. Technologies pioneered in those private mansions became standard in middle-class homes. The very idea that architecture could express ambition remains deeply American. And perhaps most importantly, the destruction of these mansions would eventually inspire something new, the preservation movement. Because after enough marble fell, people began to ask a question that still echoes today. What is worth saving, and why? In our next chapter, we descend beneath the marble staircases, below the velvet curtains, behind the carved doors. Because while the Gilded Age glittered above ground, another world existed below it, a hidden world of servants, of labour, of invisible cities beneath the stairs. If the palaces were kingdoms, someone had to run them, and their stories are just as essential. Above ground, the Gilded Age glittered. Crystal chandeliers caught the light of newly wired electricity. Silk gowns rustled across marble floors. Orchestras played beneath ceilings, painted with gods and allegories. Champagne shimmered in cut glass flutes. The men wore tailored waistcoats. The women floated in lace imported from Paris. The houses functioned flawlessly. Dinner appeared on time. Fires were always stoked. Shoes were polished. Roses were arranged precisely so. Beds were turned down before anyone asked. But perfection is never automatic. Behind the carved oak doors, beneath the sweeping staircases, Beyond the sightlines of guests and society columnists, another world existed, a city beneath the palace, and it was vast. The great mansions of Fifth Avenue and the Gold Coast were not simply large homes, they were complex organisms. They required constant motion. Heat had to circulate. Coal had to be delivered. Food had to be prepared in multi-course precision. Laundry had to be scrubbed, pressed, folded and stored. Floors polished. Windows cleaned. Silver buffed until it reflected candlelight like a mirror. The illusion of effortless luxury demanded relentless effort. In a mansion like Charles Schwab's 75-room chateau, there could be 30 to 40 servants on staff at any given time. In Harbour Hill, the Mackay estate on Long Island, that number exceeded 200 during peak seasons. These homes were not quiet residences. They were industrial operations disguised as elegance. Architecturally, the separation was intentional. Servants' quarters were hidden. Basements were expansive, housing kitchens the size of restaurants, sculleries, laundry rooms, wine cellars, coal storage chambers and workrooms. Attics were converted into dormitories for maids and footmen. Back staircases allowed staff to move unseen between floors. Hidden corridors and service entrances ensured that no guest would witness the machinery behind the spectacle. Dumbwaiters transported food discreetly. Speaking tubes connected rooms like primitive intercom systems. Bellboards lit up when a family member required assistance. A single press of a button in an upstairs bedroom could summon a maid from 3 floors below. The mansion functioned like a living body, and servants were its nervous system. Who were these workers? The vast majority were immigrants, Irish women escaping famine and poverty, German and Italian labourers seeking opportunity, Eastern European families arriving through Ellis Island with little more than hope. For young immigrant women, domestic service was often one of the few respectable employment options available. It offered room and board, a steady wage, relative safety compared to factory labour, but it came at a cost. The hierarchy below stairs was rigid. The butler stood at the top of the internal order, a commander of the domestic army. He managed inventory, supervised footmen, oversaw formal dinners, and often handled confidential matters for the family. Below him was the housekeeper, responsible for supervising maids, maintaining cleanliness, and ensuring the smooth rotation of linens and garments. Cooks operated in sweltering kitchens from dawn until late evening. Footmen assisted with serving, carrying luggage, managing carriages, and later automobiles. Valets attended directly to the master of the house, dressing him, organising his wardrobe, managing correspondence. Ladies' maids performed similar duties for the mistress. Gardeners maintained acres of manicured lawns, seasonal flower beds, and greenhouses. Chauffeurs, a new role emerging in the early 20th century, maintained automobiles, symbols of modern wealth. Every position had rules, every role had boundaries, and advancement was rare. Life below stairs was disciplined. Shifts often stretched 14 to 16 hours per day. Work began before sunrise, coal had to be hauled, breakfast prepared, fireplaces cleaned, floors swept before the family descended for the day. Uniforms were mandatory, aprons crisp, shoes polished, white gloves for formal service. Speaking directly to a family member without invitation could result in dismissal. Romantic relationships between staff were forbidden. Marriage often meant termination, particularly for female servants. Personal freedom was limited. Privacy was minimal. Bedrooms were small, frequently shared, and located in windowless basements or cramped attic corners. Meals were eaten quickly and separately from the family. The glamour upstairs rarely filtered down. And yet, within this rigid system, a parallel culture developed. Servants formed friendships, shared stories, supported one another through illness and homesickness. In some homes, entire immigrant communities were represented within the staff. Shared languages and traditions provided comfort in an unfamiliar city. There were moments of laughter, quiet defiance, secret romances conducted behind pantry doors. Life persisted, even in the shadows. The emotional labour demanded of servants was immense. Maids often raised the children of their employers, nurturing them through infancy, teaching them to walk, comforting them at night. Yet those bonds were rarely acknowledged publicly. Butlers carried secrets, financial troubles, infidelities, scandals, without ever betraying a whisper. Discretion was sacred. To serve meant to observe everything and reveal nothing. Some servants spent decades in a single household. a lifetime beneath someone else's legacy. When the master died or the family moved, they were often dismissed with modest severance and no pension. Their own stories rarely recorded, their names absent from the marble foundations they helped maintain. The contrast between the worlds above and below stairs was stark. Upstairs, silk and silver. Downstairs, coal dust and steam. Upstairs, orchestras and laughter. Downstairs, blistered hands and aching backs. But the two worlds were inseparable. Without the invisible workforce, the illusion of aristocratic ease would have collapsed. The Gilded Age was not merely a story of wealth, it was a story of labour hidden beneath wealth. And then came the collapse. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the first cuts were not to the architecture, they were to the staff. Families downsized dramatically. Entire wings of mansions were closed off. Servants were dismissed in waves. The elaborate domestic ecosystems that had sustained these palaces for decades began to unravel. Some former servants transitioned into hotel work. Others found employment as nurses, caretakers, or cooks in smaller homes. Many struggled. Their livelihoods had been tied directly to a system of private opulence that was no longer sustainable. When the mansions fell, their communities fell with them. The demolition of a palace was not just the destruction of stone, it was the erasure of an entire labour network. A hidden city dissolved. Today, when we imagine the Gilded Age, we picture chandeliers and ballrooms. Rarely do we imagine the laundry rooms, the coal cellars, the narrow beds beneath the roofline. But those spaces were just as real, just as vital, perhaps even more human. Because while marble can be replaced and land redeveloped, the lives of the people who laboured in those spaces cannot be reconstructed from blueprints. Their contribution remains largely invisible, and yet without them, none of the grandeur would have been possible. The servant cities beneath the Gilded Age remind us of something essential. Architecture tells one story, labour tells another, and both deserve to be remembered. As we move forward, we return now to one of the most audacious homes ever built in Manhattan, a palace that symbolized not inheritance, but personal ascent. A mansion that rose on Riverside Drive as a defiant declaration from a self-made steel magnate. A house that glittered at the height of American ambition and collapsed under the weight of its own excess. By the time Charles M. Schwab began building his mansion on Riverside Drive in 1902, he was already a legend. Not an inherited legend, a manufactured one. Born in a modest Pennsylvania household, Schwab had climbed, swiftly, unapologetically, through the ranks of America's most powerful industry, steel. Steel-built bridges, steel-built railroads, steel-built skyscrapers, and in many ways, steel-built Schwab. He had charmed Andrew Carnegie, negotiated with J.P. Morgan, and helped engineer the formation of U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in human history. He was not just wealthy, he was triumphant, and triumph demanded architecture. Schwab did not choose Fifth Avenue, he chose Riverside Drive. At the turn of the century, the Upper West Side lacked the prestige of Manhattan's Eastern Corridor, but Schwab was not interested in following precedent. He wanted space, visibility, dominance. He purchased an entire block between West 73rd and 74th Streets, overlooking the Hudson River. From that elevated vantage point he could see westward across the water, sunset gilding the horizon, and southward toward a city rising vertically with each passing year. This was not simply a residential decision. It was strategic. The location alone declared, "I do not follow society, society follows me." Construction began with ambition bordering on obsession. The architectural design drew heavily from French Renaissance chateaux, particularly those of the Loire Valley. Turrets, steeply pitched slate roofs, copper domes, ornamental dormer windows, carved limestone facades that seemed lifted from aristocratic Europe and transplanted into American soil. The exterior alone radiated authority. But inside was something else entirely. 75 rooms. Let that number settle. 75, each designed with intention, each executed without financial restraint. There was a grand ballroom capable of hosting hundreds of guests beneath glittering chandeliers, a music room where orchestras performed under vaulted ceilings, an indoor swimming pool, a staggering luxury in early 20th century America, a bowling alley, a Moorish-style smoking lounge with exotic detailing and deep leather chairs, an art gallery showcasing curated acquisitions, private garages, at a time when automobiles were still novelties. The house functioned not as a residence, but as an empire enclosed. The materials alone told a story of reach and wealth. Italian Carrara marble-lined staircases and corridors, exotic woods were imported from South America and Eastern Europe. Circassian walnut panelling wrapped entire rooms in dark, swirling grain. Bronze fixtures gleamed in firelight. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages descended from ceilings nearly 30 feet high. Even the fireplaces were sculptural statements, carved with precision and ornament. Everything was tactile, weighty, permanent, or at least it appeared so. Technologically, the house was ahead of its time. While much of America still relied on inconsistent municipal electricity, Schwab installed a private power plant within the mansion's infrastructure. It generated its own electricity. Elevators transported guests between floors. Polished brass, velvet-lined interiors, operated by uniformed attendants. An internal telephone system connected rooms across the vast structure. Advanced plumbing delivered hot and cold running water to marble-clad bathrooms fitted with gold hardware. Heating systems maintained comfort through New York's unforgiving winters. To walk through the riverside chateau was to walk through the future, filtered through gold leaf. And then there were the gatherings. Schwab did not build quietly. He entertained. Politicians, industrialists, foreign dignitaries, opera singers, artists. They passed beneath the iron gates as if entering a European court. Dinner menus were composed by European chefs. Champagne flowed in excess. Floral arrangements were flown in weekly from South America. Orchestras played late into the night. The ballroom shimmered with silk and diamonds. It was not subtle. It was theatrical. Schwab embraced wealth publicly, almost defiantly. Where Andrew Carnegie leaned toward philanthropy and modesty in later life, Schwab leaned into spectacle. He gambled heavily. He lived loudly. He spent without visible anxiety. Money, to him, was not something to hoard. It was something to animate. But fortune is rarely static. The 1910s and 1920s brought shifts in global markets and domestic attitudes. World War I disrupted economies, social values evolved. A younger generation questioned the morality of excess. And then came 1929. The stock market crash did not discriminate between caution and extravagance. Schwab had made risky investments. He had never embraced financial restraint. His wealth, once seemingly inexhaustible, began to evaporate. By the mid-1930s, he was deeply in debt. The mansion, once a monument to triumph, became a financial burden. Maintenance costs alone were staggering. Property taxes climbed. Servants were reduced. Entire wings of the house were closed off to conserve resources. The ballrooms fell quiet. The swimming pool stood unused. The chandeliers dimmed. Schwab held on as long as he could. Because the mansion was no longer merely property, it was identity. To relinquish it would have been to acknowledge decline. He died in 1939. The Riverside Chateau remained, but without its master it felt hollow. City officials debated potential uses. Could it become a museum, a cultural institution, government offices? The numbers did not cooperate. The land itself, expansive and valuable, was more attractive than the aging structure upon it. And so practicality triumphed again. In 1948, demolition began. The wrecking balls did not hesitate. Stone cracked, marble shattered, copper domes were dismantled, wood panelling splintered beneath steel jaws. The ballroom fell. The grand staircases collapsed. The iron gates were removed. By 1950, the mansion was gone. In its place rose Schwab House, a modern apartment complex, efficient, functional, without ornament, without myth. The only trace of the palace that once dominated the block was its name, and even that would fade into obscurity for most residents. The destruction of Schwab's mansion marked something deeper than the loss of a building. It marked the closing of an era. The idea that personal wealth should be expressed through monumental private architecture was dissolving. America was entering a new age, one defined less by individual palaces and more by corporate skyscrapers, less by ballrooms and more by boardrooms, less by dynastic stone and more by vertical glass. The skyline would continue to rise, but the private chateau would not return, and yet Schwab's story lingers, because his mansion was not built on inheritance, it was built on ascent. It was the architectural embodiment of the American promise that a man born without privilege could build something enormous, something visible, something undeniable. For a time, he succeeded. But even steel bends, even marble cracks, even ambition must yield to time. The Riverside Chateau stood for just over 40 years, in the grand scale of history, a breath. And that may be the most sobering lesson of all. In our next chapter, we return to Fifth Avenue, to a fortress not built by one man but by a dynasty. 3 interconnected mansions stretching across an entire block, a structure so immense it became known simply as the Triple Palace. The Vanderbilt family's ultimate declaration of permanence and its equally dramatic fall. If the Gilded Age had a surname, it might have been Vanderbilt. Before Rockefeller perfected oil, before Morgan consolidated finance, before Carnegie reshaped steel, there was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, who built an empire on shipping and railroads so vast it altered the geography of American commerce. By the time his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited that empire in 1877, the family fortune was almost unimaginable. And William had no intention of shrinking it. He intended to solidify it, in stone. In 1881, construction began on what would become one of the most audacious private residences in American history. Not a mansion, not even 2, but 3. 3 interconnected palaces stretching across the entire block between 51st and 52nd Street on Fifth Avenue. The public would soon call it the Triple Palace. The name felt mythic, it was accurate, the concept itself was radical. William H. Vanderbilt envisioned a unified structure housing himself and 2 of his daughters, each with separate living quarters but connected through internal corridors and shared gardens. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not merely a home, it was a dynastic fortress, a family kingdom carved into Manhattan. At the time, Fifth Avenue was already transforming into Millionaire's Row. But nothing matched the scale of what the Vanderbilts were building. Architecturally, the Triple Palace drew heavily from European influences. Renaissance and Gothic revival elements combined with Beaux-Arts precision. The facades stretched long and imposing, carved from limestone and brownstone. Balconies of wrought iron projected outward like armoured parapets. Massive arched windows rose from street level to soaring heights. Intricate stone carvings adorned the exterior. Figures, scrollwork, decorative flourishes that signalled craftsmanship and cost. It was one of the first steel-framed private residences in America. The choice was deliberate. Steel meant modernity. Steel meant strength. Steel meant that the Vanderbilt fortune was not fragile. It was reinforced. Inside, the scale was breathtaking. Each of the 3 residences had its own grand entrance, its own reception halls, its own staircases and staff quarters. William's portion dominated the corner of Fifth Avenue. It was the largest, the most ornate, the most symbolic. Visitors entered through towering doors into a hall illuminated by chandeliers shipped from Venice. The walls were lined with tapestries imported from Europe. Marble floors gleamed underfoot. A sweeping staircase curved upward beneath painted ceilings depicting mythological allegories. Every surface told a story of acquisition, of travel, of reach. The ballroom was legendary. Often exaggerated in accounts as mile long, its actual dimensions were still extraordinary. It spanned nearly an entire floor and could accommodate hundreds of guests comfortably. Gold leaf ceilings reflected light in shimmering waves. Massive mirrors amplified space and brilliance. Music reverberated beneath carved beams. This was where New York society converged. Presidents attended dinners. Foreign dignitaries mingled beneath chandeliers. Artists, bankers, politicians, all passed through those halls. The Triple Palace was not just a residence, it was a stage for influence. But the Vanderbilts were not merely consumers of luxury. William H. Vanderbilt was one of the most significant art collectors of the 19th century. The mansion functioned partially as a private museum. Its galleries housed masterpieces by Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Turner, and Corot. These works were not hidden away. Select members of the public were occasionally invited to view them. In doing so, the Vanderbilts positioned themselves not only as industrial magnates, but as cultural patrons. Their home shaped New York's identity as a centre of art and refinement. In many ways, institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art owe part of their early prestige to collections housed privately in such mansions. Yet beneath the grandeur was an uneasy truth. The Triple Palace was built on the assumption of continuity, that the Vanderbilt fortune would endure indefinitely, that Fifth Avenue would remain the epicenter of aristocratic living, that private monuments could withstand public evolution. History, however, moves quickly in New York. By the early 20th century, the character of Fifth Avenue began to change. Commercial development crept steadily north. Hotels expanded, retail stores sought prime locations, property taxes rose dramatically. The avenue that once represented exclusivity was becoming a commercial artery. The next generation of Vanderbilts had different priorities. They preferred country estates on Long Island, or retreats in Newport, or philanthropy. The Triple Palace, once a symbol of cohesion and dominance, became increasingly impractical. Maintenance costs ballooned. Staffing such a structure was expensive. The family no longer required 3 interconnected mansions in Manhattan's shifting center. In 1926, after years of deliberation, the decision was made. The Triple Palace would be sold. The announcement shocked high society. One of the great architectural statements of the Gilded Age was not being preserved, it was being dismantled. Demolition began in 1927. Ballrooms were stripped, artwork was relocated, stone carvings were salvaged in fragments. The great halls fell. Dust replaced orchestral echoes. In its place rose a commercial building. Today the site houses a luxury department store. Thousands walk past daily, unaware that beneath their feet once stood one of the grandest homes in American history. The irony is almost poetic. A palace once reserved for the most elite few became a retail space open to anyone with sufficient credit. Wealth shifted from dynastic display to consumer experience. The fortress became a storefront. The ballroom became a showroom. Permanence yielded to profit. The fall of the Triple Palace revealed something fundamental about New York. No matter how monumental a structure appears, the city will eventually demand reinvention. The same ambition that built the mansion fueled its replacement. Vertical growth replaced horizontal opulence. Corporate skyscrapers replaced family fortresses. The skyline changed. The Vanderbilts endured in name, universities, foundations, philanthropic institutions. But their greatest Manhattan monument lasted less than 50 years, a brief chapter in a city that rarely pauses. And yet, the Triple Palace was not meaningless. It represented a moment when America believed wealth could mimic royalty, when industrial success was translated into aristocratic aesthetics, when ambition reached not only upward, but outward, claiming entire blocks for private expression. Its destruction forced the city to confront a question that would echo for decades. Should architectural grandeur be sacrificed for economic progress, or can both coexist? At the time, progress won. Preservation had not yet become a movement, but seeds were being planted. Because after enough marble fell, voices began to rise. In our next chapter, we leave the fortress of steel and stone and step into something more delicate. A mansion built not for industry or dynasty, but for art. A house of stained glass and shimmering colour. A residence that blurred the line between living space and living canvas. The masterpiece of Louis Comfort Tiffany and its quiet disappearance. If the Schwab Chateau was steel translated into stone, and the Vanderbilt Palace was dynasty carved into limestone, then Louis Comfort Tiffany's mansion was something entirely different. It was light. Not the rigid light of chandeliers reflecting off marble, but coloured light, filtered light, living light. It did not seek to dominate the skyline, it sought to transform it. Built in 1885 at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 72nd Street, the Tiffany Mansion stood slightly apart from the fortress-like homes of industrial magnates. It did not roar with power, it shimmered. Where other mansions announced wealth through scale, Tiffany's residence expressed it through artistry. Louis Comfort Tiffany was not a steel baron. He was not a railroad tycoon, he was an artist. The son of Charles Louis Tiffany, founder of Tiffany & Company, he inherited access to wealth, but not its industrial obsession. His passion was colour, texture, form, glass. By the time he commissioned his Fifth Avenue mansion, Tiffany had already revolutionized stained glass. He developed new techniques for layering and texturing glass to create opalescent effects that seemed almost alive. His windows were not static images. They shifted with the sun. Morning light rendered them pale and delicate. Afternoon sun ignited them into brilliance. Even twilight gave them a subdued, mysterious glow. The mansion would become his laboratory, his gallery, his living experiment. To realize his vision, Tiffany worked with Stanford White of McKim, Mead, and White, one of the most prominent architectural firms of the era. White understood spectacle. He understood theatrical interiors. But Tiffany understood something even more elusive: atmosphere. The exterior of the mansion blended Romanesque and Renaissance influences, but it was understated compared to its neighbours. The magic lived inside. The centrepiece was the famed stained glass gable, a massive, multi-panelled installation that crowned the main stairwell. As sunlight poured through it, the interior walls came alive with shifting patterns of colour. Blue spilled into amber, crimson dissolved into emerald. The staircase beneath it seemed suspended in a kaleidoscope. Guests did not simply enter the house, they entered a prism. But Tiffany's mansion was not merely decorative, it was functional in an extraordinary way. He installed workshops within the residence itself. Artisans worked on site, experimenting with new glass formulas, soldering techniques, and layering methods. The house doubled as a design incubator. Clients from across America and Europe commissioned Tiffany windows for churches, hotels, theatres, and homes. Many of those innovations were first tested within these walls. In this sense, the mansion was alive, constantly evolving. Rooms were redecorated, panels replaced, entire galleries reimagined to reflect Tiffany's shifting aesthetic interests. The house was not static, it breathed. Social life within the mansion differed from the rigid formalities of Millionaire's Row. Tiffany hosted salons, gatherings of artists, writers, designers, Mark Twain, Henry James, Edith Wharton, musicians and poets. Unlike the hierarchical dinners of industrial titans, Tiffany's evenings emphasized conversation, ideas, experimentation, art blurred with life, high art merged with applied art. Decorative objects became philosophical statements. This was not merely a house of wealth, it was a house of creativity. Technologically, the mansion was advanced as well. Electric lighting was integrated deliberately to enhance stained glass effects at night. Mirrors were placed strategically to multiply reflections. Textures were layered so that even artificial light could mimic the glow of sunlight. The house was engineered to perform. It was theatre disguised as residence. And yet, the world was changing again. By the early 20th century, tastes began shifting. Art Nouveau, as once celebrated for its organic curves and elaborate detail, started to appear ornate. Modernism emerged. Minimalism crept into architecture. Clean lines replaced ornament. White walls replaced colour. Function began to override decoration. Tiffany, once at the cutting edge, found himself perceived as part of an older aesthetic. Demand slowed. Commissions decreased. Maintenance of the mansion, particularly the extensive glasswork, became expensive. Glass expands and contracts with temperature. It requires careful structural support. The gable alone demanded constant upkeep. Then came the Great Depression. The economic collapse struck artists and industrialists alike. Tiffany's resources dwindled. He was in his 80s. His energy faded. He died in 1933. Without his presence, the mansion lost its animating force. There was no comprehensive preservation law in New York at the time, no landmark protection, no architectural safeguards. The house was valuable land, and land in Manhattan rarely remains underutilized. In 1936, just 3 years after Tiffany's death, the mansion was demolished. There were no dramatic protests, no preservation campaigns strong enough to intervene. The stained glass was removed, the workshops dismantled, the staircase taken apart. Within months, the Glass Kingdom was gone. In its place rose a modern apartment building, efficient, neutral, forgettable. For artists and historians, the demolition was a shock. This was not merely another mansion. It was the private residence of one of America's greatest decorative artists. Its destruction became an early cautionary tale. It planted seeds in the minds of curators and preservation advocates. Because when a masterpiece can vanish in weeks, something is wrong. The Tiffany mansion's loss would later contribute to a broader preservation movement, one that would intensify after the demolition of Pennsylvania Station in 1963. But for Tiffany's house, it was too late. What remains now are fragments, scattered windows in museums, panels displayed behind glass cases, photographs in archives, blueprints in historical societies. But the experience, walking up that staircase beneath a living canopy of stained glass, cannot be reconstructed. It existed only in that place, at that time. The Glass Kingdom teaches a different lesson from the steel palaces. It reminds us that not all wealth seeks dominance. Some wealth seeks beauty. But beauty too is vulnerable. It can be deemed outdated, impractical, too fragile to maintain. And when that judgment arrives, even art can be bulldozed. The Gilded Age was not a single story. It was a spectrum, industry, dynasty, art. Each built its monuments. Each watched them fall. And now, as we leave Manhattan's avenues, we follow the Gilded Age outward, toward the water, to Long Island's Gold Coast, where a castle rose on a cliff overlooking the Sound. A Gothic dream so fantastical it would inspire one of the most iconic novels in American literature. A house that felt like fiction before it ever became one. Beacon Towers. Some mansions were built to impress, some were built to dominate. Beacon Towers was built to enchant. Perched dramatically above the cliffs of Sands Point on Long Island's North Shore, it did not resemble the industrial fortresses of Fifth Avenue, nor the elegant restraint of Georgian estates. It looked like a castle lifted from medieval Europe and set down, improbably, against the blue horizon of the Long Island Sound. White limestone walls rose into pointed spires. Turrets crowned the skyline. Arched windows reflected water and sky. From a distance, Beacon Towers seemed less like a residence, and more like a mirage, a dream constructed in stone. The visionary behind Beacon Towers was Oliver Vanderbilt Belmont, and Alva was no ordinary heiress. Born into Southern wealth, married into the Vanderbilt dynasty, and later divorced, Alva carved out a reputation as one of the most formidable women of the Gilded Age. She was bold, ambitious, unapologetic. She had already helped design and commission one of the most famous Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue. But Beacon Towers would be different. It would be hers. Completed in 1917, Beacon Towers stood on over 300 acres of land overlooking the Sound. Its design blended Gothic revival with touches of Moorish and Renaissance elements. The roofline was jagged and theatrical. Crenellations gave it the silhouette of a fortified castle. Balustrades and carved detailing wrapped around terraces and balconies. The structure was simultaneously whimsical and imposing. Unlike the symmetrical discipline of Beaux-Arts mansions, Beacon Towers embraced romantic irregularity. It felt alive. Guests approached through a sweeping drive that led to a massive arched gateway. The house revealed itself gradually, rising in stages as if unfolding. The courtyard at its centre created a sense of enclosure, protection from the outside world. Inside, the drama intensified. There were 60 rooms, each uniquely designed. High ceilings, elaborate plasterwork, grand staircases that curved like ribbons of stone. Chandeliers cast intricate shadows across patterned tile floors. Tapestries imported from Europe lined the walls. Yet Beacon Towers never felt heavy. It felt theatrical, intentional. A place designed not just for living, but for performance. The grounds were equally magnificent. Formal gardens cascaded down the hillside. Reflecting pools captured the changing light of day. A private dock extended toward the water. Stables and a chapel dotted the expansive estate. From the terraces, guests could watch sailboats drift across the horizon. The view itself became part of the architecture. Beacon Towers did not simply sit on the land, it commanded it. But Beacon Towers was deeply personal to Alva. After divorcing William K. Vanderbilt and remarrying Oliver Belmont, she increasingly devoted herself to social reform and the women's suffrage movement. She was not content with being merely ornamental. She believed in power, especially female power. Beacon Towers was her final architectural statement, a declaration that she was more than a socialite. She was an architect of her own legacy. And yet, like so many Gilded Age monuments, its lifespan would be short. In 1927, just 10 years after completion, Alva sold Beacon Towers. The buyer was William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate whose life would later inspire Citizen Kane. Hearst was no stranger to ambitious architecture. He was already building his legendary castle in San Simeon, California. But Beacon Towers appealed to his East Coast ambitions. Under Hearst's ownership, the estate grew even more extravagant. He filled its halls with medieval armour, antique furniture, rare manuscripts, tapestries from European estates, Beacon Towers transformed into a treasure vault, a curated fantasy of aristocratic grandeur. Hollywood stars, politicians, publishers all passed through its doors. Like Gatsby's mansion in Fitzgerald's novel, Beacon Towers glowed at night with lights and music. Its parties were legendary, its silhouette unmistakable. And here is where literature enters the story. F. Scott Fitzgerald lived nearby during the early 1920s. He observed the Gold Coast estates. He watched their parties from across the water. He understood their symbolism: wealth, aspiration, illusion. While no single house can be definitively confirmed as the model for J. Gatsby's mansion, Beacon Towers fits the vision eerily well. A castle overlooking the Sound, a beacon of light in the darkness, a place of grand parties and quiet loneliness. In that sense, Beacon Towers transcended architecture. It became myth. But myth does not prevent decay. By the late 1930s, Hearst faced financial strain. The maintenance costs of such sprawling estates were enormous. Public taste was shifting. The world had endured a depression and was entering war. Opulence felt increasingly out of place. Beacon Towers was shuttered, its contents auctioned piece by piece. Rooms once filled with music stood silent. Dust gathered in corners once bathed in light. And then, in 1945, the inevitable arrived. Demolition. The white spires that once pierced the sky were reduced to rubble. Stone collapsed. Balconies shattered. Gardens were flattened. What had taken years to construct disappeared within weeks. Today, nothing remains of Beacon Towers. The land was subdivided. Private homes stand where the castle once rose. There is no plaque, no marker, no preserved fragment large enough to capture its former silhouette. But the myth persists, in photographs, in sketches, in literary speculation. Beacon Towers lingers in imagination far more vividly than many surviving buildings, perhaps because it felt unreal even while it stood. Too romantic, too theatrical, too symbolic. Beacon Towers teaches a lesson different from the mansions of Fifth Avenue. It was not built to anchor industry, nor to house a dynasty. It was built from vision, from personality, from imagination. And imagination, while powerful, is fragile. It can inspire novels, it can captivate guests, but it cannot stop bulldozers. The Gilded Age often appears to us as fixed and monumental, but Beacon Towers reminds us that much of it was dreamlike. A spectacle that rose quickly and vanished faster, an illusion of permanence on borrowed time, and in its fall it echoed the very themes Fitzgerald wrote about: longing, ambition, decay, the green light across the water. As we continue our journey along Long Island's Gold Coast, we move now to a mansion quieter in design, but perhaps even more haunting in legacy. A house widely believed to have inspired Daisy Buchanan's home in The Great Gatsby, an estate that exhaled elegance rather than spectacle, a mansion called Land's End. If Beacon Towers was theatrical, all spires and spectacle, Land's End was restrained. It did not rise like a fantasy fortress. It did not glitter with Gothic ambition. It breathed. Perched quietly along the north shore of Long Island in Sands Point, Land's End overlooked the water with a calm, unwavering confidence. Its white Georgian facade faced the horizon like a figure standing still while the world moved around it. It did not demand attention. It commanded it. Built in the early 1900s, Land's End embodied a different aesthetic from the flamboyant castles of the Gold Coast. It was Georgian revival, symmetrical, balanced. White brick glowing softly beneath afternoon sunlight, tall columns framing its entrance, French doors opening onto broad verandas where sea breezes moved through linen curtains. Its beauty was not in ornament, it was in proportion. Unlike the industrial palaces of Manhattan, Land's End felt like inherited wealth, even if it was newly built. It suggested lineage, continuity, old money rather than new ambition. Inside, the home featured approximately 25 rooms. A grand central staircase curved upward beneath a modest yet refined ceiling. Drawing rooms stretched toward water views. A panelled library offered quiet retreat. Bedrooms opened onto balconies facing the Sound. There was space, but not excess. Luxury, but not spectacle. The grounds extended outward like a green carpet unrolling toward the sea. Formal gardens, tennis courts, a private boathouse. The horizon always present, a reminder that wealth on the Gold Coast was not merely architectural, it was geographic. The proximity to Manhattan allowed industrialists to maintain influence while retreating to tranquility. Land's End offered that balance perfectly. The house became known not only for its architecture but for its guests, presidents, writers, politicians. Winston Churchill reportedly visited. Theodore Roosevelt was familiar with the North Shore's social circuit. The veranda saw conversations that mingled politics and literature beneath drifting cigar smoke. It was not a palace of noise. It was a house of presence. And perhaps that is why it resonates so powerfully in American literary memory. During the early 1920s, F. Scott Fitzgerald lived in nearby Great Neck across the bay. He observed the Gold Coast. He studied its inhabitants. He watched the divide between newly rich West Egg and old money East Egg. In The Great Gatsby, Daisy Buchanan's home is described as a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. Scholars have long suggested that Land's End closely matches that description. The white facade, the commanding view, the sense of distance, not only physical distance, but emotional. Daisy's house is beautiful, but it is untouchable. Like Land's End, it feels admired from afar. It stands as a symbol of established wealth, not the striving, desperate ambition of Gatsby across the water. In that sense, Land's End became more than a mansion. It became metaphor. But like all metaphors rooted in reality, it was vulnerable. By the late 20th century, the Gold Coast had changed dramatically. Large estates were expensive to maintain, taxes increased, land values soared. Developers began subdividing properties into smaller parcels. The economics of preservation rarely favoured single-family mansions on expansive waterfront acreage. Land's End began to show signs of age, paint chipped, gardens required more maintenance than owners were willing to provide. Preservationists and literary historians took notice. Surely, they argued, a house linked to one of America's most iconic novels deserved protection. There were suggestions: convert it into a cultural centre, a writer's retreat, a museum dedicated to Fitzgerald. But the land was too valuable. In 2004, the estate sold for $17.5 million. The debate intensified. Developers examined options. Time passed. The house remained, but its future grew uncertain. In April 2011, demolition crews arrived. Despite public appeals, despite its literary association, despite over a century of standing against sea and wind, Land's End was torn down. White columns collapsed. The veranda splintered. The central staircase fell inward. Photographs captured the moment, not unlike Gatsby's dream dissolving at dawn. Within hours, what had stood for more than a century was reduced to rubble. The land was subdivided. Modern mansions, larger, more insulated, more technologically advanced, replaced the singular estate. No plaque marks the site. No preserved facade hints at its past. The view remains, but the house is gone. The loss of Land's End feels especially poignant, not because it was the largest, not because it was the most extravagant, but because it embodied restraint. It represented an era when architecture did not scream wealth, it whispered it. Its demolition underscores a recurring truth in American development. Land outlives architecture. Value shifts, memory struggles to compete with profit. And yet Land's End lives on in literature, in the image of Daisy standing at the window, in the description of a house across the bay, illuminated in twilight, in the green light flickering at the end of a dock. It exists in imagination more vividly than in stone. Perhaps that is fitting, because Fitzgerald's novel was never about permanence, it was about longing, and longing rarely endures intact. The Gold Coast was not merely a place of opulence, it was a landscape of aspiration and illusion. Beacon Towers shimmered like a dream, Land's End exhaled elegance, both vanished. But the myth of the Gold Coast persists, layered with nostalgia and tragedy. As we continue along this shoreline of lost grandeur, we turn now to a mansion less associated with literature and more with spectacle. A palace built by a man who helped invent modern entertainment. A house of parties, film stars, and cinematic flair. A coastal estate known as Pembroke. If Beacon Towers was a castle of fantasy, and Land's End a mansion of literary elegance, then Pembroke was pure performance. It did not whisper, it did not allude, it staged. Rising along the shoreline of Glen Cove on Long Island's North Shore, Pembroke stood as a bold expression of a new kind of American power. Not railroads, not steel, not banking, entertainment. It was the palace of a man who helped invent modern Hollywood. Its most famous owner was Marcus Lowe. Born in 1870 to Jewish immigrant parents on New York's Lower East Side, Lowe did not inherit aristocracy. He built spectacle. Beginning with penny arcades and Nickelodeons, he gradually assembled a chain of theatres that would evolve into Loew's Incorporated, the parent company of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, a lion roaring before every film, a studio that would define American cinema's golden age. Lowe did not act. He did not direct. He orchestrated, and Pembroke became his most elaborate stage. The estate expanded under Lowe's ownership into a sprawling 60,000 square foot residence. From the water, it appeared luminous, white walls framed against deep green trees in the vast blue of the Sound. Its architecture blended classical symmetry with early 20th century modernity. Long horizontal wings stretched outward. Large floor-to-ceiling windows faced the horizon. Terraces cascaded toward the shoreline. Unlike the fortress-like mansions of earlier decades, Pembroke embraced openness. It framed views. It invited light. It felt cinematic. The grounds were meticulously curated. Rolling lawns sloped gently toward a private dock, and there, standing proudly at the edge of the water, was one of Pembroke's most distinctive features, a miniature lighthouse, functional, romantic, theatrical. Guests arriving by boat would see the beacon glowing softly at dusk, as if entering a film set rather than a private residence. It was not subtle, it was deliberate. Pembroke was a house designed for entrances. Inside, the mansion shimmered with Art Deco influence. The Gilded Age had favoured European imitation, Versailles in Manhattan. Pembroke felt distinctly American. Bold lines, geometric flourishes, grand reception halls, a ballroom large enough to host orchestras and dancing into early morning hours, projection rooms for private film screenings, music rooms, guest suites designed for extended stays. Lowe understood hospitality and publicity. When he entertained, it was not merely social, it was strategic. The guest lists were extraordinary. Hollywood royalty, producers, actors, Wall Street financiers, vaudeville performers, political figures. During the 1920s and 1930s, silent film icons such as Gloria Swanson and Douglas Fairbanks were rumoured to have attended gatherings. Evenings at Pembroke could include fireworks over the water, orchestras on the terrace, and projected film reels shown against temporary outdoor screens. The house pulsed with movement. It was less palace, more premier. And yet, Marcus Lowe himself was reportedly modest in demeanour. He was not flamboyant like Hearst, nor aristocratic like the Vanderbilts. He was disciplined, focused. His extravagance was architectural, not personal. Pembroke was not vanity, it was proof. Proof that a son of immigrants could rise not only into wealth, but into cultural dominance. In many ways, Pembroke symbolized a transition in American identity. The 19th century had been defined by industrial conquest. The early 20th century was increasingly defined by cultural export. Film, music, mass media. America was no longer merely building infrastructure. It was building imagination, and Pembroke embodied that shift. But as with so many of its contemporaries, time proved unkind. Marcus Lowe died suddenly in 1927. Though MGM continued to thrive, the personal connection between owner and estate was severed. The Great Depression reshaped wealth. Taxes increased. Maintenance costs soared. The Gold Coast's vast estates began to feel burdensome rather than prestigious. By the 1940s and 1950s, suburban development reshaped Long Island. Large single-family estates gave way to subdivisions. The economics of holding 60,000 square feet on expansive waterfront property no longer aligned with cultural priorities. Pembroke grew quiet. The lighthouse stood as a lonely silhouette against the Sound. Ballrooms darkened. Film projectors went silent. In the early 1960s, developers acquired the property. There were no major preservation campaigns, no large-scale protests. Unlike Beacon Towers or Tiffany's Mansion, Pembroke lacked an artistic or literary mythology to rally defenders. It fell quietly. Demolition erased the white facade. The terraces crumbled, the lighthouse disappeared, subdivisions replaced spectacle. Roads cut through what had once been rolling lawns. Families moved into new homes unaware of the cinematic palace that once stood beneath their foundations. Today, almost no trace of Pembroke survives. No grand archways, no preserved wings, only scattered photographs and archival descriptions. It is perhaps the most vanished of the Gold Coast estates, and in its disappearance lies a particular poignancy. Pembroke was built by a man who created illusion for a living. Film is light projected onto a screen, temporary, fleeting. When the projector stops, the image disappears. In a strange symmetry, Pembroke itself faded like a final frame dissolving to black. The Gilded Age and its aftermath were not solely about inherited wealth, they were about reinvention. Marcus Lowe reinvented entertainment. He built a palace that mirrored his industry, bold, luminous, transient. His demolition underscores a broader truth. In America, innovation often outpaces preservation. New industries rise, new aesthetics replace old ones, land reconfigures, memory fragments. As we move toward the final chapters of this journey, we ascend once more to a mansion perched on a literal summit, a palace that crowned Long Island's landscape, a residence considered by many to be the most classically beautiful of them all, Harbour Hill, the mansion that ruled the horizon. If Beacon Towers felt like a dream carved from fantasy, and Pembroke shimmered with cinematic energy, Harbour Hill stood with something different: authority. It did not sit along the shoreline. It ruled above it. Perched nearly 375 feet above Hempstead Harbour in Roslyn, Long Island, Harbour Hill dominated the landscape with the quiet confidence of inherited power and engineered ambition. From its terraces, one could see the sweep of the Sound and, on clear days, even glimpse Manhattan rising in the distance. It was not merely a home, it was a summit. Commissioned in 1898 and completed in 1902, Harbour Hill was the creation of Clarence Hungerford Mackay, heir to a fortune born in Nevada silver mines and expanded through telecommunications. His father, John William Mackay, had struck it rich in the Comstock Lode and later founded Postal Telegraph, challenging Western Union's monopoly. The Mackay fortune was industrial, but Clarence sought aristocratic expression. To build Harbour Hill, he turned to one of the most celebrated architects of the Gilded Age, Stanford White. White was already legendary, known for blending European grandeur with American scale. Harbour Hill would become one of his crowning achievements, and tragically, one of his last. White would be murdered in 1906 in one of the era's most sensational scandals, but Harbour Hill stood as proof of his vision. The architectural inspiration came from the Château de Maison Lafitte near Paris, a Louis XIV-style palace. The facade was symmetrical and monumental. Limestone walls glowed pale in sunlight. A steep slate roof rose above ornate dormer windows. Columned terraces framed the structure with classical precision. From a distance, Harbour Hill appeared transplanted directly from the Loire Valley, but it was scaled larger, bolder, American in its refusal to be modest. Inside, the house expanded beyond imagination. Over 100 rooms, 40 bedrooms, grand salons and drawing rooms layered in silk and brocade, a marble-floored ballroom capable of hosting society's most extravagant events, a conservatory filled with exotic plants, and at its heart, the Great Hall. The Great Hall rose 2 stories high. A vast fireplace anchored one end. Carved beams crossed the ceiling. Light poured in through tall windows framing endless views. It was both gathering space and statement piece. But Harbour Hill was not shaped by Clarence Mackay alone. His wife, Catherine "Kitty" Mackay, left her unmistakable mark. Kitty was known for her commanding presence and impeccable fashion sense. She did not accept subtlety. She curated. One of Harbour Hill's most famous features was her personal marble bath, carved from a single block of Italian marble. Gold fixtures gleamed against pale stone. Wall-length mirrors expanded the space infinitely. The domed ceiling above was painted in delicate hues, transforming the bath into something closer to a temple than a private room. It was not simply indulgence. It was declaration. Harbour Hill was a social epicentre. The Mackays entertained at a level rivaling European courts. In 1926 they hosted Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, for a ball attended by more than 1,200 guests. Fireworks illuminated the hilltop, orchestras filled the ballroom. The menu was written entirely in French. Reporters crowded outside the gates. The event became legend. For a moment, Harbour Hill felt less like a private estate and more like a national stage. Yet Harbour Hill was not solely about spectacle. Clarence Mackay was deeply involved in advancing communications technology. He funded military relief efforts during World War I. He supported musicians, including the famed tenor Enrico Caruso. Harbour Hill became a crossroads of industry, culture, and politics. It embodied the idea that American wealth could shape global influence. But the Great Depression arrived with the same indifference it showed Schwab and Hearst. Fortunes contracted. Maintaining over 100 rooms required enormous staff, more than 250 at peak seasons. Entire wings were closed. Gardens fell into neglect. Kitty and Clarence separated. The social world they built began dissolving. Clarence Mackay died in 1938. Without its central figure, Harbour Hill drifted. The estate was partially sold, land subdivided. The house lingered, hollowed and quiet. By 1947, demolition crews arrived. The fall of Harbour Hill was particularly symbolic. It was not merely another mansion. It was considered one of the most beautiful private homes ever built in America. Its limestone walls collapsed under mechanical force. Ballrooms were reduced to debris. The Great Hall fell silent forever. The hilltop that once crowned Long Island with aristocratic grandeur was flattened into suburban development. A water tower and rows of houses now occupy the site. The horizon remains, but the palace is gone. Some fragments survived. Kitty Mackay's marble bath was salvaged and eventually preserved by local historical societies. Scattered stone carvings found their way into gardens and private collections. Photographs and blueprints remain in archives. But the experience, standing atop that hill looking down from a terrace carved in limestone, exists only in memory. Harbour Hill represents perhaps the clearest arc of the Gilded Age story. Rise, dominance, splendour, then decline. Its demolition marked not just the loss of a structure but the symbolic end of the Gold Coast era. Post-war America favoured efficiency over extravagance. Mass-produced suburbs replaced private kingdoms. Highways replaced carriage drives. Shopping centres replaced ballrooms. The cultural centre shifted. And yet, Harbour Hill lingers. In paintings, in local lore, in the faint outline of where foundations once met earth. It stands as a reminder that even summits erode. Even the highest points cannot resist time. The hill remains, but the crown is gone. As we approach the final chapters of this journey, we widen our perspective. These mansions did not rise in isolation. They were products of a transforming American city, a nation racing from horse-drawn streets to skyscrapers. Their fall was not accidental. It was tied to the evolution of urban life itself. To understand why these palaces vanished, we must understand the city that replaced them. While marble ballrooms shimmered on Fifth Avenue, while orchestras played at Harbour Hill, while beacon towers cast long shadows across the Sound, another transformation was unfolding, quieter at first, but far more permanent. The American city was rising, and it would not make room for palaces. In the late 19th century, New York was not yet vertical. Most buildings stood under 6 stories. Horse-drawn carriages crowded unpaved streets. Gas lamps flickered along avenues. But beneath that modest skyline, technological revolutions were gathering force. Steel frame construction, elevators perfected by Alicia Otis, electric lighting networks, telegraph and telephone lines binding buildings together. The same industrial wealth that funded Gilded Age mansions also made something else possible: height. When steel skeletons replaced load-bearing masonry, buildings no longer needed thick stone walls to support themselves. They could rise higher, lighter, faster. And unlike private mansions occupying entire blocks for a single family, skyscrapers promised something irresistible: density, profit per square foot, efficiency. The economics of the city shifted. Where one palace stood, hundreds of offices could function. Where one ballroom hosted occasional galas, entire corporations could operate daily. The skyline began climbing. The early skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan, the Flatiron Building, the Singer Building, the Metropolitan Life Tower, signaled a new era. By the 1910s and 1920s, height was no longer novelty, it was competition. The Woolworth Building rose like a Gothic cathedral of commerce. Then came the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building. Glass and steel pierced the clouds. The city that once expressed ambition horizontally, in sprawling estates, now expressed it vertically. Upward became the new outward. Simultaneously, immigration surged. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Many entered through Ellis Island. New York's population exploded. Tenements expanded, infrastructure strained, public transportation networks developed, elevated trains, subways. The demand for housing intensified. Large private estates within Manhattan began to feel impractical, out of scale, out of sync with urban density. The city needed apartments, not ballrooms, office space, not private galleries. The Gilded Age mansions had been built during a brief window, a moment when land was relatively abundant, taxes manageable, and social norms favoured conspicuous display. But cities are organisms. They metabolize land differently over time. By the 1920s and 1930s, the value of central Manhattan property was no longer aesthetic. It was commercial. Developers saw opportunity in every block occupied by a single family. The Vanderbilts' Triple Palace could house one dynasty, or it could become a department store serving thousands daily. From an economic perspective, the decision was almost inevitable. Then came the Great Depression. The financial collapse of 1929 did more than empty bank accounts. It reshaped psychology. Extravagance, once admired, became controversial. Large staffs were dismissed. Maintenance costs became burdens. The public appetite for opulence waned. Mansions built to demonstrate invincibility now felt tone-deaf in a nation facing unemployment and breadlines. Practicality overtook prestige. Even families who could afford upkeep began reconsidering. Why maintain 75 rooms when a luxury apartment offered comfort without responsibility? Why manage 200 staff when a penthouse required only a fraction? Urban living was evolving. After World War II, the transformation accelerated. The suburban boom redefined American aspiration. Families left city centres for detached homes in expanding suburbs. Highways connected boroughs and beyond. Developers subdivided former estates into neighbourhoods. The Gold Coast, once lined with singular palaces, became dotted with cul-de-sacs. Post-war architecture emphasised function. Modernism replaced ornament. Glass curtain walls replaced carved limestone. Efficiency became elegance. The cultural centre of wealth shifted again, from private palaces to corporate headquarters. Preservation, as a movement, arrived too late for many of these mansions. It was only after the demolition of Pennsylvania Station in 1963 that public outrage catalysed serious architectural protections. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission was formed in 1965. By then, the Schwab Mansion was long gone. The Vanderbilt Palace had vanished decades earlier. Tiffany's glass kingdom was rubble. Beacon Towers reduced to memory. Harbour Hill levelled. Land's End demolished. Pembroke erased. The preservation movement emerged from loss, not foresight. The irony is profound. The same ambition that built these mansions fueled their destruction. Industrial innovation made them possible. Urban innovation made them obsolete. Progress, relentless and indifferent, reshaped the landscape. The Gilded Age palaces were not destroyed by enemies. They were replaced by evolution. The American metropolis did not pause to mourn. It recalibrated. And yet something lingers beneath the pavement. Ghost grids, invisible foundations, memory embedded in maps. Walk along Fifth Avenue today. Between 51st and 52nd Street, shoppers browse luxury goods unaware that the Vanderbilt fortress once stood there. On Riverside Drive, residents enter Schwab House without knowing the chateau that once commanded the block. In Roslyn, suburban homes rest on land where Harbour Hill crowned the horizon. In Sands Point, quiet neighbourhoods overlay the footprint of Beacon Towers. The city remembers in fragments. Perhaps that is the final truth of the Gilded Age mansions. They were never meant to endure centuries like European castles. They were products of acceleration. America industrialized faster than any nation before it. Fortunes rose quickly. Architectural ambition followed. But acceleration rarely allows permanence. In New York especially, permanence is illusion. The skyline is a negotiation with time, and time always wins. Yet their stories matter, because these mansions represented more than excess. They embodied innovation, private electrical plants, elevators, plumbing systems that would later become standard. They shaped cultural institutions through art collections and philanthropy. They revealed tensions between wealth and inequality. They forced conversations about preservation, and they captured a uniquely American belief. that success should be visible, grand, unapologetic. As we move into our final chapter, we step back from demolition sites and blueprints. We ask a larger question. What do these vanished palaces teach us about ambition, about memory, about the balance between progress and preservation? Because when marble falls, something else rises, not just buildings, perspective. If you stand on Fifth Avenue today, you will not see turrets. You will not see carved limestone facades stretching across entire city blocks. You will not hear orchestras spilling into the street through open ballroom windows. You will see glass, steel, commerce, movement. And yet beneath the pavement, beneath the foundations of department stores and apartment towers, lie the invisible outlines of another city. A city of palaces, a city of ambition carved in marble, a city that believed permanence could be engineered. The Gilded Age mansions were never simply houses, they were declarations. Each one represented a particular version of the American dream. For Charles M. Schwab, it was the dream of ascent, a steelworker's rise translated into a French chateau overlooking the Hudson. For the Vanderbilts, it was dynastic continuity, a fortress spanning an entire block built to house generations. For Louis Comfort Tiffany, it was artistic transcendence, a home of light and colour where architecture dissolved into atmosphere. For Alva Belmont at Beacon Towers, it was imagination and defiance. For the Mackays at Harbour Hill, it was aristocratic grandeur on an American hilltop. For Marcus Lowe at Pembroke, it was spectacle, cinema made stone. For the quiet elegance of Land's End, it was inherited refinement and literary myth. Each mansion told a different story. Each rose quickly, each fell. Why do their losses still resonate? Because they force us to confront a tension at the heart of American identity. America celebrates progress. It celebrates innovation. It celebrates growth. Cities expand, skylines rise, land is repurposed. Efficiency triumphs. But progress often comes at a cost, and that cost is memory. When the Vanderbilt Triple Palace was demolished, it was not vandalism, it was economics. When Harbour Hill fell, it was not rebellion, it was changing land value. When Tiffany's Glass Kingdom disappeared, it was not disdain for art, it was the absence of preservation infrastructure. The city did not hate these mansions, it simply evolved past them. That may be the most unsettling realization. They were not destroyed by catastrophe, they were replaced by practicality. Yet something curious has happened over time. The buildings vanished, but fascination intensified. Photographs circulate in books and archives. Digital recreations attempt to resurrect lost facades. Historians trace blueprints. Writers evoke ballrooms and terraces long reduced to dust. The absence itself has become part of the narrative. We do not merely remember these mansions, we imagine them. And imagination, unlike limestone, does not erode so easily. There is also irony in what survived. Many of the technologies pioneered inside those homes, electricity, elevators, indoor plumbing, climate control, are now universal. What was once exclusive has become standard. The architectural experiments of the Gilded Age helped shape the modern metropolis that replaced them. In that sense, the mansions did not entirely disappear. They dissolved into the city's infrastructure. Their grandeur was absorbed into everyday life. Still, the question lingers. Should more have been saved? If Beacon Towers stood today, would it be a museum? If Harbour Hill remained, would it draw visitors from around the world? If Tiffany's mansion had been preserved, would we experience stained glass differently? The preservation movement that emerged in the mid-20th century suggests that society eventually learned from these losses. After the demolition of Pennsylvania Station, outrage reshaped policy. Landmarks commissions formed, historic districts protected. Perhaps the fallen palaces served as necessary lessons. Their absence became argument. Their rubble became foundation for preservation law. But beyond policy lies something deeper. The Gilded Age mansions reveal a psychological truth. Wealth seeks visibility. Ambition seeks architecture. Human beings build not only for shelter, but for statement. The steel kings and railroad barons believed that by shaping stone they could shape legacy. In part, they were correct. We still speak their names. Yet the buildings themselves remind us of another truth. No structure is immune to time. No facade, however ornate, guarantees permanence. Cities are living organisms. They digest their past. They rebuild. They overwrite. New York, more than any other American city, embodies this cycle. It reinvents itself constantly. It consumes space. It demands efficiency. Its skyline is a ledger of ambition, revised every generation. The Gilded Age mansions were one chapter in that ledger, a brilliant, extravagant chapter, but not the final one. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson. The mansions fell, but ambition did not. It simply changed form. The 19th century built horizontally, spreading across blocks in limestone and marble. The 20th century built vertically, steel and glass piercing the sky. The 21st century builds digitally, data centers, financial networks, virtual worlds invisible yet immense. The expression of power evolves. The impulse behind it remains constant. When we walk past Schwab House on Riverside Drive, we may see only a mid-century apartment complex, but beneath it once stood a palace that symbolized the height of American industrial confidence. When we pass the luxury storefront occupying the Vanderbilt block, we may see commerce, but beneath that floor once stretched a ballroom, glowing with gold leaf and chandeliers. When we drive through suburban Roslyn, we may see quiet streets, but atop that hill once stood Harbour Hill, crowned in limestone. The land remembers, even if we do not. In the end, the story of the 7 lost mansions is not simply about demolition. It is about transformation, about a young nation testing the limits of wealth and design, about individuals translating financial triumph into architectural grandeur, about a city that refused to stand still, and about the fragile illusion that stone can outlast change. If you close your eyes, you can still imagine them. The iron gates opening, carriages rolling across gravel drives, guests ascending marble staircases, music echoing through vaulted halls, light pouring through stained glass, fireworks over a hilltop, laughter drifting across water. For a moment the palaces stand again, not in reality, but in memory. And perhaps that is enough, because while marble falls, stories endure.